I would guess that most people have not trained to failure, and yet it seems to be one of the hottest topics in the world of weight training. So what is the deal, and what does our current body of scientific literature say? Plus, what's my opinion and application to training? Let us find out. I'm Annie Miller, and I help you learn as you train and enjoy your lifts again without having to figure it out for yourself. And I help coaches build sustainable and data-backed online health and fitness businesses without selling your soul to vanity metrics. Let me be very clear that training to failure is not training until your form turns to hot, steamy garbage. Training to failure for muscle growth refers most often to when the concentric phase can no longer be completed. That would be the raising portion of a bicep curl or standing up out of the bottom of a squat or pulling yourself up to the pull-up bar. Concentric is the phase of movement when the muscle contracts and shortens. So a trainee reaches failure when that can no longer be completed. You'll often see bodybuilders continue past this point and enter a full fatigue of the concentric portion, but have someone assist them in that and then do the eccentric portion only until they can literally no longer complete that either. And thus they reach total muscular failure. That is not what we are discussing today. Though I would be interested to see if there is any additional hypertrophic effect gained when bodybuilders do this, when they go past that concentric failure all the way into eccentric failure or not. I digress. People doing that are looking for that last 1% of muscle growth, so it makes sense. You are not, and I am not either. So we're asking, do you and I, common gym folk, need to train to failure? And if not, how close do we need to get to failure? First off, you need to train to failure. You need to train to failure in order to know if you're close to training to failure or not. People wildly and commonly underestimate their ability and stop far too soon thinking they're close to failure when they are in fact not. To train to failure, you're going to do AMRAPs, which is as many reps as possible until you can no longer complete that concentric shortening phase. I suggest doing this with lighter loads, shooting for something like 12 to 15 reps. You'll likely find that you underestimate and can get closer to 20 plus reps. That's how you determine what failure feels like, or that's what I suggest. Do it with a few upper and lower body exercises this week if you have never done that, but also please do consult with your coach if you are working with someone, and be safe. Most studies that I looked at anyway use RIR, which is reps in reserve, to determine how close to failure the trainee gets with their exercise. RIR is commonly used incorrectly from its intention, which is in fact how I use it with my clients because it just makes more sense. As originally created, did you know that RIR 0 technically stands for one more rep left in the tank, and the next rep would be a fail? RIR 1 means 2, so on and so forth, which is dumb and doesn't make sense. So I say 0 reps left in reserve means you have 0 reps left in reserve. If I am in fact incorrect, I'm willing to admit it, so happy to change my mind if needed. Should you train to failure? Depends on your training age and why you're doing it. As I said, AMRAPs are a great way to learn what failure feels like and to better select your working loads if you are newer to lifting. But within your actual training, I do not think that you need to be lifting to failure, if that makes sense. Noobs can improve motor pattern and gain muscle without needing to train to failure. If you're intermediate or advanced, you may need to train closer to failure, but not to failure necessarily. This is a really interesting finding from a systematic review, resistance training recommendations to maximize muscle hypertrophy in an athletic population. The article reads, novice lifters can achieve robust gains in muscle mass without training at a close proximity to failure. As an individual gains training experience, the need to increase intensity of effort appears to become increasingly important, meaning the older your training age becomes, if you've been consistent, that assumes, the more important it may be for you to get closer to failure within your working sets. Although speculative, highly trained lifters, for example competitive bodybuilders, may benefit from taking some sets to momentary muscular failure, in such cases its use should be employed somewhat conservatively, perhaps limiting application to the last set of a given exercise. So they're saying even for someone like a competitive bodybuilder, again, not you or me, you would only be taking that last working set to failure. They're saying there may be speculatively gains to be made there. It also says, moreover, confining the use of failure training primarily to single joint movements and machine-based exercises may help to manage the stimulus-fatigue ratio and thus reduce potential negative consequences. So here they're basically saying that it does not make sense to take a back squat, something that is axial loaded, it has a high systemic load, to failure. This would be for something like a bicep curl, a lateral raise. These are single joint exercises that would be considered maybe more isolated. That is where it would make sense to take something to failure because the risk is lower. And again, that's only saying for bodybuilders taking something to actual failure. Now, the following meta-analysis, effects of resistance training performed to repetition failure or non-failure on muscular strength and hypertrophy, looked at studies using failure training or non-failure training for both strength and hypertrophy, which is literally what the title just told us. LOL. Moving on. We're going to look at just hypertrophy, which would be muscle growth. To be clear, there is no significant data supporting the need for failure training to improve strength. Now for hypertrophy, same. So this meta-analysis states, in general, studies used moderate to high loads, which was 60 to 90% of their 1RM, in their resistance training programs. This aspect is relevant because the upper limit of motor unit recruitment is thought to be around 60 to 85% of maximum force. So same. In other words, when exercising with such training loads, high threshold motor units tend to be recruited from the onset of the exercise, and the additional increase in force beyond the upper limit of the motor unit recruitment is accomplished by rate coding. Therefore, training to muscle failure may not be needed for motor unit recruitment when using moderate or high loads. However, it should be noted that simply because a fiber has been recruited does not mean that it has been sufficiently stimulated to hypertrophy. So we can recruit a muscle fiber without demanding that muscle fiber to grow. We have to increase the intensity enough for that muscle fiber that it tells it, wow, this is a new stimulus that I have not yet experienced and I need to grow. Literal hypertrophy. It continues, thus, while the level of recruitment may provide a partial mechanistic explanation for these findings, it would appear that other factors are involved as well. All of that is to say, training at 60 to 85 or 90% can stimulate large percentages of muscle fibers, but is it to a degree that forces the muscle to grow? That's where returning to the previous study is helpful. You don't need to train to failure, but you do likely need to train close to failure to hit that threshold and be using those challenging enough loads according to this most recent meta-analysis. The second one that I just said was that 60 to 90% of your 1RM load. It seems possible that training to failure or near failure is more important for muscle growth the more trained that you are, as I've mentioned. This is still a hypothesis, but it does seem plausible. I fully agree with the article's areas for future research statement, as this is what we want to know. It states, future research should seek to quantify the lower threshold as to how many repetitions short of failure would be sufficient to elicit an optimal adaptive response. That's really what we want to know. Is it a 2 RIR? Is it a 1 RIR? We don't know. We just speculate that you need to get close to failure to get a hypertrophic response from those muscle fibers that are being recruited. And again, like I said, it needs to be at a challenging load, that 60 to 90%. At the end of the day, we know that mechanical tension is the main driver of hypertrophy. You do not need to train to failure to get the same results you can acquire without training to true failure. For most people, there does seem to be a point of diminishing returns. And if you have a higher training age, research suggests that perhaps training close to failure is going to be needed in order to gain muscle mass for you, which makes sense when we think about progressive overload and those bodybuilders pushing all the way past that concentric failure to eccentric failure. I'll keep my eye out for more research. You keep coming back for those educated gains, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. It was a lovely little video.